Hello all and welcome back to my channel. My name is Pandey and thank you very much for watching my other videos. I am hoping that my videos are adding some values in your day-to-day Intune operation work. Please consider subscribing my channel. By subscribing, you will get access to new videos as soon as they are uploaded, and it's a great way to stay up to date with my content and support me at the same time. So today we are going to talk about Intune Graph Explorer basics. By understanding the technology and terminology used in the Graph and Graph Explorer, we can understand the Intune API in a better way. This understanding can help us to effectively utilize the Intune API to manage and secure the device application and data within the Microsoft 365 environment. Additionally, by automating Intune API tasks using scripts or tools like Microsoft Power Automate or PowerShell, we can save the time and improve overall efficiency in managing our organization Intune environment. So in this module, we will be covering several topics related to application programming interface or APIs, and especially focusing on the Microsoft Intune Graph API and how to use the Graph Explorer tool. I will start by discussing the basics of API and how they works. Then we will dive into REST APIs, which is a type of API that use HTTP methods to communicate with resources. I will explain what Microsoft Graph is and how many ways we can use to pull the data from it. Then we will talk about Microsoft Graph Explorer, which is a web-based tool that allows you to interact with Microsoft Graph and test your query before implementing them in your code. Then I will talk about the backend steps involved in making a request using a Graph Explorer. After that, I will cover Microsoft Graph Intune Query, a powerful feature that allows us to retrieve specific data from Intune using Graph Explorer. Then I will explain what a resource is in context of Microsoft Graph API and which HTTP methods are available for making requests. Additionally, we will discuss how to choose the appropriate API version and the importance of access token in Microsoft Graph API. So before we begin, if you are new to my channel or yet not subscribed my channel, please consider subscribing my channel and turn on the notification so that you won't miss any of my videos. Now let's start the module and first understand what is API. So API stands for Application Programming Interface. An API is a set of definitions and protocols that allow technology products and services to communicate with each other via the internet. API allows two software programs to communicate with each other. One program can call another program's API to get access to data or functionality of the other program. Now let's see how an API works. So the very first step is the client application initiates an API call to retrieve information, also known as a request. This request is processed for an application to the web server via the API's Uniform Resource Identifier, also known as URI, and includes a request verb, header, and sometime a request body. After receiving a valid request, the API makes a call to the external program or web server. In the next step, server sends a response to the API with the requested information, and in last, the API transfers the data to the initial requesting application. Now let's understand it by the simple non-technical example as well as a technical example. Let's consider that we are sitting in a restaurant for dinner and ordering food. We check the menu, ask the waiter if a dish is available, and then the waiter sends our order to the kitchen. The chef prepares the food and give it back to the waiter, who is bring it to our table. Similarly, when we make a request to API, it acts like a waiter and sends our request to the backend or server, which processes it and sends the response back to the API, which then deliver it to us. And we can see the same thing in the picture also. Now let's understand the same thing with the technical example. Imagine we want to book a flight ticket from the GoIbibo website. We start by checking our travel date, time and destination on the GoIbibo site. Once we have selected the airline we want to fly with, such as Air India, GoIbibo will send our request to the Air India API using the authentication provided by the Air India. After receiving the request, Air India API will take the appropriate action and sends the response back to GoIbibo. We can then see the status of our booking, whether it is confirmed or not, on the GoIbibo website. Now let's see what is REST API. So the full form of REST API is Representational State Transfer, also known as REST, is a architectural style that defines a set of constraints to be used for creating web service. REST API is a way of accessing web service in a simple and flexible way without having any processing. REST or RESTful meaning each unique URL represents some objects. REST technology or protocol is generally preferred to be more robust over simple object access protocol, also known as SOAP technology or protocol, because REST uses less bandwidth, simple and flexible, making it more suitable for internet use. REST API is used to fetch or give some information from a web service. All communication done via REST API uses only HTTP request, and a REST API uses HTTP and supports the HTTP post, get, put, patch and delete method. These corresponds to create, read, update and delete operation respectively. Now let's understand how REST API works. So a request is sent from client to server in the form of web URL as HTTP get or post or put or delete request. After that, a response comes back from the server in the form of resource, which can be anything like HTML, XML, image or JSON, but now JSON is the most popular format being used in web services. Now we know that what is API and what is REST API. Now let's understand what is Microsoft Graph API. So in simple term, Microsoft Graph API is like a bridge that connects different Microsoft tools and services, allowing them to work together seamlessly to enhance your productivity and user experience. Microsoft Graph is an API that brings the API like Microsoft Team API, SharePoint API, Intune API services together. Microsoft Graph API provide access to the data stored across Microsoft 365 services. Customer can use the Microsoft Graph API to connect the data and to enhance the organizational productivity. Microsoft Graph is a tool that allows different Microsoft products and services to work together and share information, making it easier for user to access and interact with data across different apps. Microsoft Graph API supports paging and returns 100 objects per pages. Microsoft Graph API requires delegated permissions, and Azure Global Admin must consent your application in the tenant. So overall we can say that Microsoft Graph API provides a unified API that can be used to access the data and intelligence stored throughout your organization in various services such as Microsoft 365 service, Enterprise Mobility Plus security services, Windows 10 services and Dynamics 365 Business Central services. Now let's quickly see how many ways we can pull the graph data. So there are many ways we can use to fetch the graph data, such as we can use Graph Explorer, we can use PowerShell Evoke REST method, Power Automate and Logic apps to pull the graph data. We can also use a Postman and Python to access the graph data. If we are using Linux or Unix, we can pull graph data by running the curl command. There are some other client SDKs like Java and C Sharp to access the graph data. This module we are only going to discuss about the Graph Explorer and how we can use Graph Explorer to pull the Microsoft Graph data. Now let's see what is Microsoft Graph Explorer. So Microsoft Graph Explorer is a website that allows us to interact with Microsoft 365 Azure resources like Intune. Graph Explorer is a browser-based tool provided by the Graph team which help us to get to know the graph better. Microsoft Graph offers us a single endpoint called https://graph.microsoft.com to access the data in Microsoft 365, Windows 10 and Enterprise Mobility and Security, and can be used by makers and developers. Now let's see what are the Microsoft Graph request backend steps. So there are 5 steps in Microsoft Graph request. The very first is the access token. So this is the first step in making a Microsoft Graph request, is to obtain an access token. So this is a security token that grant permission to the access Microsoft Graph API. This access token is obtained by authenticating with the Microsoft Identity Platform, which requires the users to provide their credentials. Second step is the request method plus URL, which contains the request body. So once the access token is obtained, the developer can construct the request. This includes specifying the request method such as get, post, put, delete, and the URL of the Microsoft Graph API endpoints and any additional parameters or data required by the request, such as a query parameter or request body content. Third step is to send the request. So after the request is constructed, it is sent to the Microsoft Graph API endpoint using a networking protocol such as HTTP or HTTPS. The request includes the access token in the request header to authenticate the user and authorize the request. Next step is the Graph API process request. So the Microsoft Graph API process the request and perform any necessary actions such as retrieving or modifying data in the user's Microsoft 365 account. The Graph API validates the access token, authorize the request, and perform any necessary data processing or manipulation requested by the request. And the next step is the response. So finally the Graph API returns a response to the developer application. The response includes a status code such as 200 for successful request and request headers such as content type or content length, and the response body such as JSON or XML data. The developer application can then parse the response and use the return data as needed. So overall the process involves obtaining the access token, constructing a request, sending the request to the Microsoft Graph API, processing the request, and returning a response. Now let's see what is Microsoft Intune Graph Query. So Intune Graph Query is the API call used in Microsoft Graph Explorer to get, put, patch, and delete the information from the Intune services. Graph Explorer is one of the way to fetch, change, or remove the data configuration from the Intune services. And the syntax of the Intune Graph Query is like https://graph.microsoft.com. Then we have a version. After then we have a resource. Then we have to provide the ID. Then we have to provide the property. And last we have to provide the query parameters. So there are two types of version used in the Microsoft Graph API. The first one is the version 1.0, which is a production version, and the beta version, which is still in development phase. Next one, we have a resource, and the type of resource being queried such as user, groups, mail folders. Device management is for device node in the Intune portal, and device app management is for the app node in the Intune portal. And this parameter is required Next we have a ID. So this is the unique identifier of a specific resource instance be queried. For example, if querying a specific user, this would be a user ID. This parameter is optional and can be omitted if querying multiple resources or a collection of resources. Next one is the property. This is the specific property of the resource being queried. This parameter is again optional and can be omitted if querying the entire resource or multiple properties. And the last one is the query parameter. So this is an optional query parameter that can be used to filter, sort, or otherwise manipulate the query result. The parameters are separated by AND character and also include a option like $filter, $select, $order by, $top, and $skip. Overall, the Microsoft Graph Query URL format allow developer to construct a request to query specific resource, property, and data within the Microsoft Graph API. By including query parameters, developer can also filter and sort the results to get the exact data they need. Now let's talk about the HTTP available request method. So HTTP defines a set of request method to indicate the desired action to be performed on a given resource. And there are 5 main methods available in the Microsoft Graph Explorer, and these are get, post, patch, delete, and put. So get request is a representation of a specific resource, and the request using get should only retrieve the data. Post is used to submit an entry to the specified resource, often causing a change in the state or side effect on the server. Patch is used to apply partial modification to a resource. Delete method is used to delete the specific resource, and put method replaces all the current representations of the target resource with the request payload. Now let's talk about the Graph API version. So there are 2 API versions available, and we call it as beta and version 1.0. The version 1.0 endpoint contains operations that have been thoroughly tested and are ready for production use. The beta endpoint includes the newer operations that have more recently been published for public testing. The beta endpoint is not advisable to use in the production because the operation cannot guarantee to work. Beta endpoint operation can receive changes without advance notification, so there is a risk if you are relying on them in your application, your app might stop working in such situation. If we cannot find any operation we need in the version 1.0 endpoint, we might want to look to the beta endpoint documentation and check if it is available there. Sometimes even if the operation is available via both the endpoints, the beta endpoints might have some additional properties that have not yet been published to the production ready endpoints. Now let's quickly talk about what is resource in Microsoft Graph API. So resource refers to an entity that can be managed through the Microsoft Graph API. A resource in Intune Graph Explorer refers to something that can be managed or accessed through Microsoft Graph API. This includes the things like device, user, apps, and policies. All resources have a specific scope, like user.read let you read the profile of the signed in user, or user read all let you read the profile of all users present in the directory. So let's see some of the example how we can use Microsoft Graph Explorer to manage the resources. So mobile app is a resource class containing the base properties for the Intune mobile apps, and the URL for mobile app is https://graph.microsoft.com/version 1.2 and then device app management. Whereas users resource represents an Azure directory user account. This resource is an open type that allows the properties to be passed in, and the URL for user is get https://graph.microsoft.com version 1.0 and then users. Managed devices is another resource in which device that are managed or pre-enrolled through Intune, and the URL for manage device is get https://graph.microsoft.com version 1.0 and then device management. And the next one is the detected app is a managed or unmanaged app that is installed on a managed device. Unmanaged app will only appear for the device marked as corporate owned, and the URL for that is guest https://graph.microsoft.com, then version 1.0, then device management, and then we have a detected apps. Now let's see what is access token in Microsoft Graph API. So an access token is an opaque string that identifies a user, app or page and can be used by the app to make a Graph API call. An access token is like a movie ticket by which your application give it to Graph to show it has a permission to access the requested data in Microsoft 365. Access token contain both authentication and authorization information. Authentication provides information about who you are, while authentication provides information about what you can do. Together, authentication and authorization are used to control access to resources in services like Microsoft Graph API. Like we can see that in the screenshot that the user is not having a required permission to access the device app management resource, and that is why they are getting a forbidden 403 errors saying that user does not have a sufficient privilege or you need to consent to one of the permission on the modified permission tab. We can use jwt.ms or jwt.io site to decode the access token. So JSON Web Token or JWT is a compact URL which is safe means of representing claim to be transferred between two parties, and JSON consists of three parts: a header part, a payload part and the signature part. So header is typically consists of two parts: the type of token which the JWT and the algorithm that is used such as HMAC or SHA-256 or RSA SHA-256, and it is a base 64 URL encoded to form the first part of JWT. Payload contains the claim. There is a set of registered claim. For an example, ISS is used for issuer, EXP is used for expiration time, SUB is used for subject, and AUD is used for the audience. These claims are not mandatory but recommended to provide a set of useful. This payload can also include extra attributes that defines custom claims such as employee role. Typically, the subject claim is used to create the OpenID, connect user subject. However, JVM server can be configured to use the alternative claim. The payload is base 64 URL encoded to form the second part of JWT. And the third part is the signature. To create a signature part, the encoded header and encoded payload are signed by using the signature algorithm from the header. And this signature is used to verify that the issuer of the JWT is who say it is, and to ensure that the message was not changed along the way. So in the screenshot we can see that the access token contains information such as the application name like Graph Explorer, the application ID, username, user UPN name, scope and permission of the user, the tenant reason. So that's all for this video. In the next video I will show you and explain how to use HTTP methods such as get, put, post, patch and delete to access, modify and delete the Intune data. I hope this is an informative video for you. Thank you very much for watching this video.